I know most of you on screen, but for those who don't know me, my name is Mia. I am the Executive Director of René Cassin, the Jewish Voice for Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining us for Lessons Across Generations, Deprivation and Food Poverty, as part of the René Cassin and Generation to Generation Human Rights Through the Generation series. The series aims to trace the development of human rights principles from the Holocaust to today, highlighting how historical experiences inform and resonate with contemporary issues. Those of you who are new to René Cassin, we are the Jewish Voice for Human Rights in the UK. Our mission, grounded in Jewish teaching, values, and dignity, and the community's historical experiences, is to promote and protect human rights in the UK. We operate at the intersection of community mobilization, narrative change, and policy advocacy. We draw our inspiration from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted by our namesake, Monsieur René Cassin, in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The declaration was the first expression of global commitment to protect human dignity, demand accountability, and act when others need protecting. We work in partnership with Generation to Generation, also known as G2G, which enables the descendants and close friends of Holocaust survivors to share the survivors' experiences before and during the Holocaust. Last year, G2G speakers presented to around 50,000 people in schools, universities, prisons, public and private organizations across the UK. And their presentations evidence the range of experiences and human rights abuses survivors went through before and during the Holocaust. A big congratulations to G2G, as this year marks your 10th anniversary, which I know you will celebrate later in June. Tonight's event brings together perspectives across generations to explore one of the most urgent and persistent issues in the UK today: food poverty and deprivation. While this is often discussed as a contemporary policy challenge, it is also a deeply human issue, connecting past and present, and raises fundamental questions about dignity, rights, and responsibility. I am delighted to introduce our two speakers for this evening. We will first hear from John Wood, a member of G2G, who will share his father's story. Belsen Liberator Lt-Col Leonard Barney, one of the first Allied forces to enter the camp on the 15th of April, 1945. We will then hear from my colleague, Jonathan Chern, René Cassin's Advocacy Coordinator, on how access to adequate food is not simply about charity or provision, but rather a matter of justice and rights. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. As you've noticed, this event is being recorded. You will have an opportunity to ask both John, and Jonathan questions after they've completed their presentations. So John, without any further ado, if you're willing to take the mic,
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Okay, fine. Well, thank you. While I'm sharing the screen, thank you so much for inviting me to make this presentation. It's a real honor, and I hope you find it interesting and educational. So here we go. On the 15th of April, 1945, my father, Leonard Barney, then a major in the British Army, found himself at the gates of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. He was actually one of the first British officers to arrive there, together with his senior officer, Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, and a few other officers. Shortly after the liberation of the camp, which is located in northwest Germany, the well-known BBC broadcaster Richard Dimbleby filed this now historic report of what he saw there.
There are 40,000 men, women and children in the camp. German and half a dozen other nationalities, thousands of them Jews. Of this total of 40,000, 4,250 are acutely ill or dying of virulent disease. Typhus, typhoid, diphtheria, dysentery, pneumonia, and childbirth fever are rife. 25,600, three-quarters of them women, are either ill from lack of food or are actually dying of starvation. In the last few months alone, 30,000 prisoners have been killed off or allowed to die. Those are the simple, horrible facts of Belsen.
By the time the British arrived, only around 60 of the hundreds of Belsen staff remained, half of them women guards, to greet the British and officially hand the camp over to them. The others had run away. They'd lined up on the road outside the camp with Commandant Joseph Kramer out in front. Kramer had some handover documents for my father's senior officer, Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, to sign. And he told Taylor that there were about 60,000 prisoners in the camp, of whom he estimated 10,000 were dead and unburied, and that the death rate was running at around 500 a day. He also said that there had been no food or water in the camp for several days. Kramer then accompanied my father and a couple of other officers into the camp together with 2 army photographers. They drove the half-a-mile length of the camp and back in a jeep with a loudspeaker and witnessed tens of thousands of severely malnourished prisoners, as well as thousands of corpses strewn around the camp, some in piles and some in a large mass grave. Announcements were made in German and other languages that the British Army had arrived to take over the camp and that the inmates were now safe, but they had to stay where they were. My father and other officers were traumatized by what they saw, as he explains here.
When we went in and drove through the camp, there was a long road right through the camp with wooden huts on both sides. There were piles of corpses on both sides of the road. And in between the huts, there were piles of corpses. And as we drove along, we could see in the trees back of these huts greater piles of corpses. There was an enormous stench of death, and it was really, really awful. At the very end of the camp, there was a big mass grave about the length of a tennis court, I suppose, and with hundreds of corpses already in it. A scene which we had no conception at all. We'd been fighting battle after battle from Normandy for 10 months up to that time when we got to the camp. And we were used to seeing casualties and people killed, but never have we seen anything like this at all. The people that were there were mostly emaciated, walking skeletons in a complete daze. They didn't really realize that they'd been rescued. There were a few that were in a better condition, but most of them were really sick and ill and in a terrible state. Some wearing prison clothes, some wearing rags. And I remember it was an absolute Dante's Inferno. I'll never forget it.
Initially established in May 1940 as a prisoner of war camp, Belsen was not intended to function as a concentration camp. As a result, it was never equipped with more than the most basic facilities for the disposal of bodies. This was manageable as long as the prisoner population was small, where disease was the exception rather than the rule. From October 1944, however, Belsen became a destination for thousands of prisoners from across occupied Poland, especially from Auschwitz, who were forced by the Germans to walk enormous distances, sometimes in freezing conditions, from which many did not survive. This is why these journeys became known as death marches. However, many thousands did survive the journey to Belsen, making the camp heavily overcrowded very quickly. It was only designed to hold a maximum of 20,000, yet it now housed 60,000, which inevitably led to malnutrition due to lack of food and typhus and other diseases. In fact, between January and April 1945, over 35,000 prisoners perished there, since many of them were already suffering from starvation and disease when they reached Belsen, and their condition rapidly worsened due to inadequate shelter, food, water, and sanitation there. As the camp population exploded, the result was chaos as body disposal didn't keep up with deaths. Getting back to the liberation, a senior medical officer of the British Army, Brigadier Glyn Hughes, Deputy Medical Superintendent of the 21st Army, took over command of the camp in order to deal with its overwhelming medical problems. With the purpose of saving as many lives as possible, the Brigadier immediately set out the Army's priorities, with providing food and water obviously at the top of the list. Dad was given the task of getting the water supply working again, as it had been damaged by Allied bombing, as he explains here.
I went back to the camp and reported to the military government commander there, who was there by that time, he said that he'd like me to take charge of the water supply. The water would be arriving for Army units to try and get the camp system going again, and to try and sort of organise the obvious panic of the people who hadn't had water and control matters to try and get it reasonably civilised, which is what I had to do at the camp. We did have, of course, dozens of regiments have a water truck arrive and establish points where people could fill cans and whatnot, and then trucks had to go away, refill and come back. And eventually, one unit produced an electric generator, and we got the camp water system going again. And what had been broken, we had some people find straws in the camp, got it repaired. So we eventually, after a couple of 3 days, got the water system going. So that kind of resolved that problem.
In terms of the food situation, here is a video testimony by Belsen survivor Susan Pollack, who is originally from Hungary.
Liberation came in Belsen, Bergen-Belsen. I heard some shouts, some loud announcers to said we were liberated, but it didn't mean anything anymore to me. And those who were able to walk, I could see that they went to the food where the food was stored, and gorged themselves, and many died because we were starving, you know.
And in this next video clip, my father explains the food situation from his point of view, the problem of distributing it, and the enormous quantity of food he found nearby.
With the food, of course, food started to arrive, but what arrived, of course, was army rations, which consist of bully beef and cheese and things like that. And quite soon, the part of the military that was detailed to do that got the cookhouses going, and started brewing up enormous masses of sort of army stew. And the whole problem was how to distribute it, because the people who were fit took it, and there was nobody to give it to the people in the huts who were too ill to move. So we had a big problem how to handle that. But so that was what they were doing, and that's was the first kind of move to help the poor people over there. After that, I was given a job because they had found out, or somebody had found out, that up the road, 3 or 4 kilometers up the road, there was, or supposed to be, a very large German army barracks. I was told to take a jeep and a couple of men and find this place and see what was going on there, and how it could be used or not, or what it was, which is what I did. And indeed, there was a very large, perfect, beautiful army barracks, which had been the tank training school for the German army. It consisted of block after block of two-story blocks and sort of dormitory blocks, big officers' mess, a large hospital, food, what do you call it, dining areas, parade grounds, facilities of all kinds. A really wonderful place. The German army had gone. There wasn't any German soldiers there at all. But on investigation, I found quite a lot of the civilians who ran it, I mean, did the sort of administration of it, and stayed there. And there was a very large food store with hundreds of tons of potatoes and vegetables, dried milk, tinned meat, and as you would expect in a very large barracks. I don't know how many soldiers the barracks was built for, but it certainly would be more than 20,000. It was a very large place. And they had all these food stores there. So that was good. And I told the people, you know, it was now British Army property and the state put, and they'd be hearing more, but we're taking over. I also found that in that barracks they had a very large bakery, which was capable of baking 60,000 loaves of bread a day, and a very big store of flour to do it with. All this, I'm telling you, was 3 kilometers away from Belsen camp where people were starving. So that was requisitioned. I also found in the nearby village a dairy centre where milk and dairy products were sort of processed and organised. And so I told them, you know, that's requisition too. And from that, of course, the idea is that the British Army would really take over this barracks and use it in the dealing with the problem of Belsen.
In trying to feed the inmates as fast as possible, and with every good intention, the soldiers gave the starving survivors their rich, high-calorie compo, as it's called. It was their rations, which consisted of tinned meat, puddings, chocolate, etc., as well as a thick meat stew, which inadvertently and very sadly ended up causing a fatal condition known as refeeding syndrome, resulting in roughly 2,000 additional deaths in the first few weeks after liberation. Unbeknown to the soldiers, refeeding syndrome is where sudden high-calorie intake by someone severely malnourished causes electrolyte imbalances, low phosphate, potassium, magnesium, leading to heart failure, diarrhea, dehydration, and death. The severely malnourished lose the ability to process normal food. This is because their shrunken intestines cannot handle and the body cannot metabolize high fat or high protein intake. It was really tragic, and even more for the liberating troops to have to deal with emotionally. This then prompted gradual feeding trials by the medics, around 100 medical student volunteers from 9 London teaching hospitals at the liberation. Students were deployed because the crisis was so great. It shows how badly stretched the army was at that time. Nurses were also deployed there, one of them being the late Helen Bamber, who was inspired to great work as a result of her experience at Belsen. In 1985, she founded the Medical Foundation for the Victims of Torture and set up the human rights charity, the Helen Bamber Foundation, in 2005. In an attempt to safely rehabilitate the starving, gradual feeding trials started at 10 calories per kilogram body weight daily, kilocalories, which is the equivalent of 2 or 3 large potatoes, ramping up over 4 to 7 days with multivitamins. The method involved introducing food slowly and carefully, allowing the body to gently readapt to nutrition. Survivors were given the Bengal famine mixture, which had been developed during the famine there, which had killed between 1.5 and 3 million people in 1943. Later, the Drummond mixture, after Sir Jack Drummond, scientific advisor to Britain's Ministry of Food, who developed it, was employed. It consisted of an easily digested porridge or specialized mixture, focusing on easily absorbed nutrients that would not overwhelm the digestive system. Drummond arrived at Bergen-Belsen about a month after its liberation, summoned due to the initial feeding failures that caused thousands of refeeding deaths. He provided expert guidance on managing mass starvation, drawing from his experience in similar situations. Giving the survivors glucose, proteins, and vitamins intravenously proved to be effective and safer for those cases with a collapsed digestive system than feeding them orally. These efforts reduced daily deaths from 500 or 600 a day to under 50 a day. Belsen's post-liberation experience, especially the deaths that resulted from the survivors being given food that was far too rich for them, directly formed protocols at other sites liberated soon after, like Dachau, where Brigadier Glenn Hughes was later dispatched to oversee the relief effort there, Ebensee, Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Theresienstadt, and Mauthausen, enforcing similar gradual low-calorie feeds, intravenous fluids, and supplements to prevent fatal electrolyte crashes. The medical teams at these other camps were trained on Belsen's controlled diets and intravenous nutrition, thereby dramatically reducing mortality at these camps too. By summer 1945, these tactics halved death rates in DP camps across Germany and Austria, shaping World Health Organization guidelines on famine relief into the 21st century, which provided the foundational modern scientific data for treating severe acute malnutrition in subsequent decades, ensuring that refeeding begins with extremely controlled, specially prepared and easily digestible nutrients. The lessons learned from the disastrous initial feeding attempts at Bergen-Belsen fundamentally changed the medical understanding of starvation, directly influencing how future similar cases were handled. In fact, the medical understanding of nutrition and starvation was fundamentally changed by the experience of World War II in general. Rationing in the UK, for example, actually meant that Britons were fed properly for the first time as income disparities ceased to matter. Research on survivors of all camps, including those in the Far East, provided huge amounts of useful data. Going back to immediately after Belsen's liberation, now that the water system was back up and running, my father then scouted around the area, as he explained in the video, to see what local food supplies he could find. And luckily, just a few miles away, there were the huge German barracks seen at the top of the picture, filled with enormous quantities of food, as well as the bakery that he explained that can produce 60,000 loaves of bread a day, which for some reason the Belsen staff were not using to feed the 60,000 inmates. Here is a picture of the entrance of the camp, and here is a selection of some of the buildings. So to sum up and to finish, during the Belsen trials in September 1945, Kramer's defense as to why the prisoners were starving to death was that he had no food to give them. There clearly was more than enough with which he could have fed all the prisoners if he had wanted to. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, John. I think it was quite moving how you were able to incorporate testimonies by your dad, so to hear his own voice recall what he saw.
Thank you.
Jonathan, I'm going to move on to you. Right to food, or the situation of food poverty in the UK today.
Thanks, Mia, and thank you, John, for that presentation. Growing up Jewish in the community here and with grandparents who are Holocaust survivors, you hear a lot, but that's taught me a lot of new things, and it's quite moving. But thank you. Thank you to everybody else for coming here and spiting the sun on an evening like tonight. So tonight, I'm going to speak about what the right to food means, both in theory and in practice. So food is an essential part of all of our lives. We all rely on food to survive, but also we rely on food to build relationships, to show love, to interact with our culture or the culture of another's. There's a phrase that people often use: do you eat to live or do you live to eat? And this evening, I want to talk about how, in many ways, the right to food actually addresses both of these ideas. So in other words, food is a human right in that we physically need nutrition and calories in order to live, but we can also enjoy food, to have choice over what we eat. And as I'll talk about later on, to maintain the diet of one's choice. That's a really important thing in the right to food. Food is tied to dignity and identity. The core question of the right to food is not simply, are people eating? It's, are they eating with dignity? Do they have meaningful choice? Do they have access to a balanced diet? So today I'll cover this in three structures. So the first part, I'll be talking about how the right to food developed. Then I'll be talking about why we actually need a human rights framework when it comes to food access. And then I'll end by talking about some work that we've been doing at René Cassin on food adequacy and how the right to food intersects with kashrut, or sort of culturally appropriate foods. So food as a human right may be a relatively new idea, but of course the idea that people should not go hungry is not a new idea across societies from around the world for thousands of years. Feeding others has been a moral obligation. In the major religions and many other cultures, there are deep traditions of feeding those in need. This is embedded in religious law and communal life. And so historically, like I said, across the world, you see communities support the poor. Authorities will respond at least sometimes to things like famine. But these systems all have a common feature that food depends on goodwill, charity, and it depends on political power. It doesn't depend on entitlement, which is what the right to food brings in. So this all changes in the 20th century, where human rights come in. After the Second World War, the world began to recognize that the basic conditions of life must be protected as rights. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who our namesake René Cassin was the principal drafter of, the UDHR recognized the right to an adequate standard of living, and this includes the right to food. In fact, Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes this explicit. It's part of what we call economic, cultural, and social rights, and it would be more developed later on, but it was always envisioned as an integral part of human rights. So I'm just going to read out what Article 25 of the UDHR says, just to make this point. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family. Gendered language there would be themselves and their family now, of course, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond their control. So this, what we might call our Article 25 rights, they got their own treaty in 1966. It's a binding treaty called the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which, if I refer to it later, I'll probably call it ISESCA, because it sounds nicer and it's much easier to say. So that's in 1966. So we've got the 50th anniversary this year. No, sorry, 60th. Am I right? Yeah.
It's the 50th anniversary of the UK ratifying it this year. So they signed it earlier and it took them a while to ratify it.
Thanks, Helen. I appreciate that. I always get mixed up with the dates. I just sort of suddenly realized, wait a second, we're not in 2016. Anyway, ISESCA recognized, amongst other things, the fundamental right to be free from hunger. So human rights brought in a profound shift in how we understand food access. Food is no longer something you receive if you're lucky or deserving or if you're visible. It becomes something you are entitled to as a human being. So importantly, what this actually means in societies is that governments become duty bearers and people, us, become rights holders. And this is the fundamental aspect, at least in my eyes, of human rights. As long as we live in a state system, there has to be a framework of protection to not only guard, but to also promote the rights of people from, I guess, to put it in Weberian terms, the state's monopoly of force. It's absolutely essential if we are to live in a state system. So the government owes you a positive duty in order for you to fulfill a dignified life. Today, the right to food is understood as a framework with 4 key pillars, and these are that food must be available, accessible, adequate, and sustainable. So I'll go through each of those. Availability means that there is enough food in the society, whether that's through production, supply chains, or distribution. Accessibility means that people can actually get that food. So it's physically there, but it makes it within reach. So economically, it's affordable. That's sort of the main thing about accessibility. You can have a supermarket packed with shelves, but if people can't afford what's on them, food isn't truly accessible. Then there's adequacy, which I'll talk more about later, because that's work that we've been doing at René Cassin. But adequacy means that food meets people's needs, that it's safe, it's nutritious, and culturally and socially acceptable. So it's not just about calories and offering people, giving somebody the same sandwich every day and being like, that's fine, you're fine. But it's about whether the food is something that people can eat with dignity, in line with their identity and their beliefs. So this is where things like respect for kosher laws come in. And then finally, sustainability means that access to food is stable over time, not dependent on short-term fixes that can disappear, but it's secured for future generations. So going back to ISESCA, the UK has ratified the treaty, so what Helen was talking about, ratified the treaty in 1976. But the treaty isn't something like the Human Rights Act, which is enshrined in UK domestic law. Ratification means that a state consents to be bound by a treaty, but it does not incorporate that treaty into law. And ISESCA is something that was as well written to be gradually implemented. So it wasn't the case where in 1976, the UK ratifies it and everything changes overnight. It's meant to be gradual, but if we get to the point where I end up doing my whole advocacy spiel, not enough movement has happened in the past 50 years. So we're in a situation really where the right exists in principle, but in practice, it's often delivered through sort of uneven policy choices, sort of like ad hoc policy choices. It's through local provision, or increasingly it's through charities, because it's not guaranteed as a legal entitlement. And that gap between the recognition and the implementation is at the heart of many challenges we see today. So moving on, why we need a human rights framework for food, given that food is widely available still. So the 4 factors I was just talking about, a right to food framework ensures that all 4 of those are addressed at the same time. So hunger is not primarily about scarcity. Like I said, food is widely available. In some contexts it is, but it's also about access and inequality. So a quick snap, some stats of the UK. Around 1 in 7 households in the UK experience food insecurity. Among households with children, this is from Trust with Trust, I grabbed a few hours ago. Among households with children, it rises to around 1 in 5. Food bank use has reached record levels, and millions of food parcels are distributed annually. And this is happening in a wealthy country. We're obviously facing economic difficulties like the rest of the world, but there is an abundant food supply and highly efficient markets. And that tells us something important, that hunger today is a failure of policy more so than production. So those 4 standards, accessibility, availability, adequacy, sustainability, if we break it down, food is available, but it's rarely accessible, adequate, or sustainable. And it changes in different contexts how much each of those are met. So I'm sure you're all aware through sort of how armed conflicts disrupt supply chains, with obviously what's been happening the past few months with Iran. But that's not just oil production, it can disrupt food systems too. Of course, with climate change, that's massively going to change how food is produced and its availability and its affordability. And having just emergency responses can just prioritize what I was talking about before, calories over adequacy. So this is where sustainability comes in. Ensuring sustainability really creates a long-term plan to mitigate short-term crises in food availability. Then on accessibility, why we need that. So it's about food not just being physically there, but economically available. Accessibility would likely be implemented through things like regulation on markets, as well as better resourcing for food providers in private, as well as public and third charity sector. The need for this becomes apparent where we look at how markets distribute food, which is according to purchasing power, not according to need. If you have money, you can access food, but if you don't, the system does not guarantee anything. So increasingly, we see that charities, including a number of charities we work with, René Cassin are not a frontline charity, but we, are very glad to have great relationships with a number of food banks and a number of, synagogues and churches and organizations who do actually sort of fill in this gap. And they're essential, but they're limited because it kind of creates this patchwork system, which is dependent on local capacity and unable to guarantee adequacy. So food banks have been expanding through periods of economic growth, and people are priced out of adequate diets even when food is plentiful. So it's this feeling that even as you might think material things in society are getting better, if you don't have a right to food framework, people's access to food doesn't actually sort of catch up with it. So like I said before, market forces respond to purchasing power, and so if supermarkets or other private sector suppliers don't make a profit for providing food, then they won't provide it, and this puts burdens as charities. And like I just said, charity is optional, and even in some cases it can be conditional. And another problem that both public and private sector face is they tend to have a utilitarian response to food demand, so providing the base need for a high amount of people. And this could cause people to slip through the cracks. I'll talk about this more when I speak about food adequacy. But if you're, for example, somebody who keeps kosher but does not live in a Jewish area, neither supermarkets, restaurants, or food banks are going to really be able to cater for you. And a right to food framework would change this, in part because it would also change how people view their own access. So people often self-exclude rather than push for better provision for themselves. And that's not how rights are supposed to work. To take the example I just used, a Jewish person who lives in, not even the middle of the countryside, but major cities like Belfast or Cardiff, they should be able to access their rights without having to move to another country. So I'll talk about the adequacy thing, which is the last pillar of the right to food, and something that I spent a lot of time researching and speaking to people about over the past few months. So in a snappy sentence, adequacy means that food is not just fuel. There's a Charlton Heston film called Soylent Green, where some of you might have seen it, but everyone in a society is given the same food ration. And while something like food availability and accessibility is met, adequacy is not, because it does not meet individual needs. I won't spoil the film, but it does turn out a whole range of other human rights are not met through the production of Soylent Green. But crucially, to move on, adequacy means that the food which is provided is nutritious. It must also be appropriate to one's health needs and appropriate to one's cultural needs. So I often use myself as an example. I'm vegetarian, which is a personal moral choice. I also have celiac disease. So I have to keep a gluten-free diet as a health necessity. And I also grew up in a kosher household, even though I'm not kosher anymore. But suppose I was, it would still be my right to access a diet which was vegetarian, gluten-free, and kosher. I often feel embarrassed and I don't like being a burden. But it's that thing I spoke about before. We are rights holders and the state is a duty bearer. And we should not feel like a burden, even though I'm naturally sort of, oh, I'm sorry, like, I'm sorry for being difficult. Because when one thinks of oneself as being cumbersome, when we think of our rights as being cumbersome, we risk giving them away. And that applies for any human rights, whether they're economic rights or anything across the boards. So there's a real issue where systems treat rights as an extra or a special requirement or something that can kind of be approximated. And if you kind of hit the right quota, if you hit enough people, then it's kind of fine. But faith appropriate food really must not be treated as a special requirement. It is a core component of adequacy. Something we all know is that food is massively important to our lives, not just its mere existence, but how we treat it. For many communities, food is not a preference, it's an aspect of identity, dignity, religious observance. In such a way, food is both an economic right and a cultural right. And I think the Human Rights Act recognises this. So the actual enshrined aspect of human rights law in the UK, Article 9 of the HRA is the freedom of religion, and that includes the right to manifest one's belief through practices. So that includes things like worship, but it also includes the right to keep a kosher diet or halal diet or a vegetarian diet. It includes the right to fast over whether it's Yom Kippur or Ramadan. It includes the right to not have chametz over Pesach, all of these things. Because that is how we manifest our freedom of belief and our freedom of religion. But in practice, a lot of systems often fail here. We just submitted evidence on how faith appropriate food is accessed, and this involved us speaking to communities across the UK where barriers to accessing faith food were limited. So there are examples of like consistent mislabeling of kosher, halal, Hindu meals. Someone's telling me he ordered a Hindu vegetarian meal and was given a meal with beef in it, which is shocking. I don't know how that was made, but it was a private provider who did that, and they said, oh, they spoke to somebody who told them that beef is fine for Hindus to eat. It also happens in hospitals. One issue that happens a lot actually in hospitals is someone will have to choose between a meal which is medically appropriate, for example, if they have diabetes, and a meal which is culturally appropriate. So there's no option to have a meal which satisfies both. So there's no option to have a meal which, for me, which would be gluten-free and kosher, or something that I do as a vegetarian who's also gluten-free, something I do personally experience a lot in many places is that there's no option for something which is vegetarian and gluten-free. And it means, what I had to eat that day is really, it's not something I want to talk about. I'm happy to talk about that bit more in the Q&As because I'm conscious time's moving on, but we did a whole consultation on that. So there are lots of examples we can talk about. So I'll just move on. So one major theme that I did want to talk about is the assumption made by many service providers that one food model can work for everyone. So you often get, everybody will be given, so if it's catering for a large or a group of people, so you get this at things like stadiums, but also in big hospitals, things like that. This sense that there's a lowest common denominator meal which will satisfy the most amount of people, and that's something that I actually have thought as well. Sometimes I used to work in catering and I had that opinion too, but it's not necessarily true. I was going to run through examples, but I realized we have 10 minutes left, so I can just wrap up and see if people want to pick things up on the Q&A. I'll just close out. I think if there's anything I want to end on, I think it'd be for us all to appreciate that we all equally have the right to food, and that with all our rights, we do not only gain that right at the moment where we experience food deprivation, we are rights holders, whether we have a great diet or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And as your colleague, I'm going to steal your phrase. Where was it? Hunger failure is policy more than production, because I think that goes to the core, especially for a G7 country like the UK. I'm going to open it up for any questions. Helen, I don't want to put you in the spot, but I am. We are privileged to have Helen Flynn from Just Fair with leading So if you've got any questions, our audience, please by all means to John, to Jonathan, and Helen, if there's anything you want to add. Yeah, Jonathan, sorry.
I'm not sure if it's just my internet, but I think you cut out there for a moment.
Me too, here too.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So,
did Helen hear me putting her on the spot?
Was it if I have any questions or anything I want to add?
Please.
Hello, everybody, and it's so lovely to be here. Firstly, John and Jonathan, I want to say a huge thank you. This has been absolutely excellent, and I am so glad I did not go to the park with my kid and instead sat here for this. She still went to the park, don't worry. It's been so excellent and so informative, and I have so much enjoyed it. I did want to, well, my first question, here's the kid in question. This is Saoirse, everybody. I was going to firstly ask about whether your submission would be publicly available, but Mia, I see that you've already posted it. My other comment, and I'm just wondering what John and Jonathan think about this. I was thinking yesterday, actually, one of Saoirse's little friends has severe allergies, and the way her school has dealt with that is that they just don't eat in the classroom because, you know, her food allergies are of an airborne kind of way. And I'm just curious about your thoughts, because my thoughts that not only does this kind of rights-based approach help us consider how people move through the world, but actually it helps us, I think, really appreciate where other people are coming from and find solutions in a way that perhaps doesn't pin it on, oh, it's that person's fault because they have this going on, but it makes us think more in a way, you know, I don't really like the phrase rights and responsibilities being tied together, but I do feel at the same time we all have responsibilities as people in a society. And it's that kind of like, well, of course, you know, we just don't eat in our class because one person needs that, and that's what we do as a society. So I was just wondering about any thoughts about that. And yes, she is my little mini-me.
She's very cute.
yeah, I'm happy to come in. So yeah, it's interesting. It threw up a lot the work we were doing over the past couple of months where we were speaking to well, was my internet cut out? I'm not seeing
No,
my screen. Oh, okay. Sorry, yeah. Yeah, so it came up in the sort of interviews we were conducting the past few months where we were talking about to people about what actually food's adequacy means for them, that you know it probably is quite difficult to as much as I you know make demands of duty bearers as we call them. It really does take a degree of nuance and a degree of actually looking at minutiae of communities to be able to implement the right to food effectively. And that probably takes a whole different framework and a whole different logistical structure to implementing. I fortunately I can say this, but I don't have to design and write legislation or design food policy, and I'm not a civil servant, so I'm a bit privileged. But you know, it probably does take a whole different logistical I guess framework. And one of the things that we asked for is that there's just a lot more community between a lot more consultation between councils and local communities in the ability where councils are deciding resource allocation. Obviously, it depends on what the council type is. Councils are deciding resource allocation to just speak a lot more to communities and try and be a bit more proactive in understanding what one might call hidden or invisible groups within communities. So that example I used before of somebody who's from a religious community but lives in an area where there aren't many of those people. I don't know if that answers your question, Helen, but I think hopefully one of the benefits of that was that just be that it also from a top-down way encourages people to be a bit more sort of gracious and aware of each other's needs.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, and it just like considering each other and thinking about like how we work together in community and in society. And I also think for the duty bearers, so if you're working in a local council, being able to say, well, I need more resource so that I can meet this right. Like I do think it's a lever. It's not just a stick to beat duty bearers with, but it's an enabler to let them do the work that they want to do, I think.
I think also just to build on what Jonathan said and came out from the consultation, there's so much instinctively good work happening. So I'm sure there are schools, there are circumstances where it's not singling out, but it's just creating this naturally equal space for everyone. So exactly like Jonathan said, part of accessing rights and being able to enjoy rights is about having these conversations, just that we have had with other faith communities around access to food. But it's maybe, in terms of policy development, it also almost becomes like an ask. Make sure you speak to similar councils, make sure you speak to similar bodies of decision makers, because that's where the wealth of information is. Right to food is happening informally in small scale. What we need is big scale national policy. Conscious of time, any last questions or comments, John, by you? If your dad listened to Jonathan's presentation now, having seen what he saw and having experienced what he did and the role he played in just developing international global standards on how we address deprivation and food poverty, what do you think he would say?
That's a really good question. Actually, I have no idea what my dad might have said. I know he wanted to forget everything about Belsen as much as possible, or the trauma he went through. But luckily, thanks to Holocaust deniers that irked him, he started to tell the world what he could remember about it. But I know he felt terrible about the fact that the British Army, by mistake, killed 2,000 people. That's a horrific situation, isn't it? And how they didn't expect that when the food was trying to be distributed, it never got to the people that needed it because it was eaten by everybody on the way. That's another thing they didn't foresee. But I'm sorry, that doesn't answer your question, but I'm not quite sure what else he would say, actually.
Okay. Jonathan, any final words from you? Maybe a call to action, challenging our participants?
Yeah, I guess. Well, of course, once again, thank you everybody for being out here and not out in the sun. I can feel sitting next to my window myself, sort of the greenhouse effect happening here. Yeah, call to action. Well, so we just submitted, as I said, a response to the UK Right to Food consultation, which Mia posted in the chat. So please do read about that. That will be used to inform a roadmap, which I think will be published around September time. So largely watch this space. But yeah, I mean, I think of yourselves as rights holders is maybe my final point. I don't know if there was anything I was missing, René Cassin wise, Mia.
No, that's fine. I'm just gonna thank Jonathan. This is part of the series is running with G2G, Generation to Generation. I have now shared in the chat the link where you can sign up Right to Health. Again, with a speaker from G2G, it'll be on the anniversary of the NHS on the 5th of July. So definitely something to look forward to with our partners from Just Fair, actually.
So what is Just Fair? I'd like to know what that is.
Helen, your elevator pitch.
We are a UK-wide, which makes us sound grand, but organisation of about 9 people, and we work on economic, social and cultural rights, trying to make them real, essentially, in people's lives in the UK. So policy work, but also working with communities on the ground for them to use in their social justice work.
Now, what's your website?
Google Just Fair.
Okay.
Find us.
Dot something. Okay.
Yes, it's probably .org. But
okay.
Yeah.
I'll check.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
my internet has is signaling that it's the end of the session. Please sign up to our events. Please sign up to our newsletter. Become a friend. Donate for has lots of work to do. We've got great partners, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge to make the case for everyday rights here in the UK. So please join our community. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you again, John. Fascinating recount your dad's incredible. And Jonathan, I'm really delighted that you're leading on a Right to Food and Everyday Rights campaign. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.